The equipment never crossed a border. That is the fact that this settlement turns on, and it is the fact that pulls apart an assumption baked into export control law for decades. A European company's China-based subsidiary transferred semiconductor manufacturing items to a foundry already on the prohibited entity list, and neither the origin nor the destination was outside China. The transfer moved across a courtyard between two entities both physically inside the country, and the Bureau of Industry and Security settled the case for $1.5 million. One document read carefully, and then read again for what it declines to address. The first reading tells us what the record says happened and what the agency determined. The second asks what the settlement text does not settle, about the gap it exposed, the compliance architecture it quietly indicts, and the response it never names. The settlement record identifies the violating entity as a China-based subsidiary of a European company, not the parent acting from abroad. A legal entity incorporated and operating within China, subject to the Export Administration regulations because it handled controlled items, bound by those regulations wherever it sat. The items themselves are described in the settlement as semiconductor manufacturing items subject to export controls. The record does not require that they were novel or cutting edge. It requires only that they were controlled and that the destination was prohibited. That threshold, plainly, was met. The recipient foundry appears on the entity list. That designation means the United States government had already determined this foundry to be an entity to which exports and re-exports are restricted without a license. The settlement treats this designation as a background fact, already established, already public, already binding on anyone moving controlled items toward it. The subsidiary was obligated to observe the restriction. The transfer occurred regardless. The Bureau of Industry and Security assessed a civil penalty of $1.5 million and resolved the matter administratively, which is the standard disposition for cases that do not rise to criminal referral. The record does not characterize the violation as willful. It establishes that it occurred, that the recipient was prohibited, and that the items were controlled. That is what the first reading gives us, plainly and without inference. Now the settlement says something else in how it phrases the transfer. It calls it an in-country transfer, and it calls it unauthorized, and those two phrases appear alongside each other without any regulatory definition of how in-country transfers were meant to be detected, reported, or prevented under the compliance programs then in place. The settlement establishes the violation. It declines to establish whether the systems meant to prevent that violation were designed to see this category of movement at all. That is a significant silence. A compliance program oriented around exports, around the movement of items across an international boundary, does not necessarily contain a mechanism to screen internal transfers between two entities both located within the same country. The settlement does not say whether the European parent's compliance program addressed in-country transfers. It does not say whether the subsidiary was required to check internal movements of controlled items against the entity list, or whether that obligation was understood, documented, or trained upon by the people responsible for it. Consider what the settlement describes about the items themselves: semiconductor manufacturing items. That phrase is precise enough to establish regulatory coverage and broad enough to leave open the question of what specifically moved, at what point in the manufacturing chain, and with what capability implications for the foundry receiving them. The settlement text does not describe the item's function, their generation, or their relationship to the foundry's production capacity. That omission is not an oversight. Settlements routinely withhold operational detail, and there are legitimate reasons for that practice. But it means the record cannot tell us whether the transferred items materially advanced what the foundry was capable of producing, or whether the violation was primarily procedural in its consequence. The document establishes that something controlled moved to somewhere prohibited. It does not establish what that movement produced or enabled. Think of a lease agreement written to govern what a tenant may carry out of the building. The agreement is thorough about exits. It says nothing about what may be moved between apartments on the same floor. If one apartment on that floor is prohibited and items move to it without crossing the lobby, the agreement as written has no mechanism to flag the movement, not because the drafter was careless, but because the agreement was conceived around the threshold, and the threshold was the door to the street. Export controls, as historically written, were conceived around borders. The threshold was the customs declaration, the shipment manifest, the exit. An item that never reached that threshold, never entered the mental model the compliance architecture was built to serve. The settlement refers to the transferring entity as a China-based subsidiary, a phrase that implies the parent company's awareness of the subsidiary's operations without the document asserting that awareness. The parent is European. The subsidiary is the named party in the transfer. The Bureau of Industry and Security chose to resolve this as a subsidiary-level matter. The record does not describe what the parent knew, when it knew it, or through what reporting channel any knowledge would have traveled. That boundary around corporate knowledge is drawn by the settlement's structure, not stated as a finding. The parent's position in the record is its absence from the findings, and that absence is itself a kind of statement about what the agency chose to establish and what it chose to leave open. The penalty amount, $1.5 million, sits at a level that suggests a resolved, non-egregious violation, rather than a case with aggravating factors such as willfulness or concealment. The Bureau of Industry and Security penalty guidelines weigh those factors explicitly. Their absence from the settlement's characterization implies the agency found neither. But the settlement does not affirmatively say the company self-disclosed, cooperated fully, or remediated its compliance program. These are the factors that typically reduce penalties in Bureau of Industry and Security actions, and their mention or non-mention shapes what the record says about the posture of the company before and after the transfer. The text leaves this column blank, and what is absent from that column matters as much as what appears in it. The settlement also does not say how this violation came to the agency's attention. The mechanism of detection is entirely absent from the public record. That absence is significant because it determines whether this case represents an investigative success or a voluntary disclosure. A compliance program that generates a voluntary disclosure is behaving differently than one that conceals until discovered, and the settlement, as written, does not permit a reader to determine which of those describes the company's posture. The record establishes what was found and what was paid. It does not establish who told the agency, or when, or why. The settlement text does not tell us whether this is the first case of its kind or one of several the agency has resolved on similar in-country transfer grounds. Without that context, a close reading cannot determine whether the agency is establishing precedent or closing out a backlog. The record is one data point with no denominator. The settlement does not address whether the agency has since issued guidance clarifying the compliance obligations for in-country transfers by subsidiary structures. If such guidance exists and postdates this settlement, the record captures the violation, but not the regulatory response to the gap it revealed. An absent clause is not proof of intent, and a penalty is not a comprehensive audit. The settlement establishes what was found and what was paid. It does not establish the full scope of the company's controlled item inventory in China, the breadth of its subsidiary network, or whether other transfers occurred that did not result in enforcement action. Read together, these silences mean the settlement is authoritative about one transaction and one penalty, and suggestive about a problem in how export controls were designed. But it cannot by itself establish the scale of that problem, the prevalence of similar arrangements, or whether the regulatory framework has since been revised to address what this transfer exposed. What this settlement, read closely and then read again, actually establishes is narrower and more significant than a fine. It establishes that the regulatory definition of an export, built around border crossings, around the movement of items from one jurisdiction to another, had an interior blind spot. An item inside China, moving to another entity inside China, did not trigger the same compliance reflexes as an item moving from Germany to Shanghai. The settlement records that this gap was real, that it was exploited in at least this instance, and that the Bureau of Industry and Security determined it constituted a violation worth $1.5 million to resolve. What the document does not record, and what its silence most plainly points toward, is whether the companies still operating subsidiary structures across China have rewritten their compliance programs to see what this subsidiary failed to see, or whether they are still reading the same lease agreement that says nothing about the corridor. The border was never the boundary. The next document worth opening is the compliance guidance the Bureau of Industry and Security issued in the months following this settlement, if it exists. Does it address in-country transfers explicitly? Or does the agency's written guidance still treat the export as a threshold event? That text, or its absence, is the next record to read closely. If you read documents the way this channel does, twice, and for what they leave out, subscribe and turn on notifications, and we will keep reading.